Good afternoon. My name is John Lindahl, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series held here at the Museum of Nebraska History every third Thursday of the month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Our speaker today is a member of the Historical Society staff. Gayla Koerting joined the Nebraska State Historical Society staff as Curator of Government Records for the State Archives late last year. She is a native Nebraskan who was raised around the Norfolk area. She earned her doctorate degree from Kent State University in 1995 with specializations in Civil War Reconstruction history and also military history. In 2002, Gayla received her MLS degree with an archives emphasis from Indiana University at Bloomington. Most recently, she wrote an opinion piece for the Lincoln Journal-Star on the myths of Abraham Lincoln as a speechwriter in commemoration of the bicentennial of President Lincoln's birth. She is a contributor for the published work Prairies and the Plains, the reference literature of a region, which is now being distributed through the University in Chicago Press. Her topic today is the role of the First Nebraska Volunteer Infantry Regiment in the Battle of Fort Donelson during the Civil War. Please welcome Gayla Koerting.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank members of the Nebraska Department of the Sons of the Union Civil War Veterans who are here greeting. And also, if you have any questions about reenacting, they do that quite a bit. They're in their garb right now, so please feel free to talk to them afterwards. I am very pleased to be here, and I'm also very excited because I love to speak about the Civil War, and I appreciate you taking your time during the lunch to come out and hear me speak. My title is for the day, The Role of the First Nebraska Volunteer Infantry Regiment During the Battle of Fort Donelson During the Civil War. And I'm going to give you a few goals and objectives of what I'm going to be doing today. The first thing, I'm just going to provide quite a bit of background information because I think when you're discussing Civil War, you need to understand why the battles are taking place in the first place. Secondly, I'd like to give you some key highlights of the battle. I'm not going to go into what every commander and regiment is doing. I think that would take up too much time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this up into about 3 phases. And keep in mind that this battle took place between February 11th to the 16th, 1862, and I will show you this on a map. It is located in Fort Donelson. It is located in Stewart County in northern Tennessee. It's right along the Kentucky border. Northern is part of Tennessee. It's right along even the Kentucky border a little bit. Also, certainly what my topic is about, I'm going to talk about the role of the First Nebraska in this particular battle. They were actually very crucial in repulsing one of the Confederate attacks, and I will tell you where that's at. Final part of it, I'll talk a little bit about the major outcomes of the battle and also why this battle really was quite significant for the Union. First thing, got to give you some background here. And people are going, why are you mentioning Kentucky? Kentucky, keep in mind, when the Civil War started, Kentucky was a vital border slave state. And they had declared neutrality about the first few months, several months of the war. Well, there have been people trying to change their mind, but really what did it was this. You had an individual named Leonidas Polk, a Confederate military commander. He was known as the Fighting Bishop. And I just thought, there are pictures of him in his Confederate uniform, but I just thought I'd show you him in his religious garb here. What he ends up doing is he orders and dispatches some troops to basically occupy Columbus, Kentucky in September of 1861. Now, since Kentucky had already declared its neutrality, it's already starting to have Union leanings here. Well, basically that ended it. Polk's occupation of Columbus did it. It's considered one of the biggest blunders by a Confederate military leader. And the state quickly fell under Union control. Keep in mind, the state of Kentucky is still in a very precarious situation, as it's just now entered the Union, and the Union wants to make sure that they're going to maintain control of Kentucky, and also that you're going to be talking about, keep in mind where it's located geographically. It's right by Tennessee. The southernmost state right underneath it is Tennessee. That is a Confederate stronghold. And when you see where Forts Henry and Donelson are located, you will find out very quickly what's going to happen there. Give you a little background here on what's going on and what leads up into this battle. First thing you have to mention is General Ulysses Simpson Grant. Grant at the time is in the Western Theater, and one of my colleagues gave me a nifty laser pointer so I can go and do this. One place. Oh, that's hard for... I told John it's very hard for me to stay in one place when I'm speaking. I told him that. I'm like the Energizer Bunny when I start speaking. Well, keep in mind what's going on here. Ulysses Simpson Grant is actually a garrison commander at the time, and he's the garrison commander at Paducah in Kentucky. He starts looking at a couple of things here, and he notices, and he starts writing to his superior officer, William Henry Halleck. He tells Halleck, you know, I think there might be some weak links here in northern Tennessee. And if we can take advantage of it and get control of these particular areas, this will be a big benefit for the Union. And what he notices, and here I'm going to note these out in the back here, is, first of all, the first place that he decides to attack is Fort Henry, which is right here. This is right along the Tennessee River. The second place that he notices, which will be crucial, which is 12 miles away, is Fort Donelson, which is right here, and that's right along the Cumberland River. Notice a couple geographic points here. Eventually, there's going to be a big battle in April of 1862 at Shiloh, but also notice Fort Donelson and why this is also crucial. Not only is it a river network, but notice where Nashville is located. So geographically, these are very important. And once again, they're right along this Kentucky border here. And Kentucky is still in a little bit of a tenuous situation. The Union wants to get control, and look at this. If you have Confederate garrisons here at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, they're very open to attack here. So that's why the Union wants to get control of it, and that's why Grant decides to proceed on it. Halleck gives him permission, and to make a very long story short here, what Grant does is he gets a Union gunboat fleet to come in couple days earlier. And I will be perfectly honest here, Fort Donelson was really not that difficult of a battle for Grant and his forces. By February 6th, he has captured Fort Donelson. The Union now has control of the Tennessee River up to that point. And what I give to you, and it's on the table there if you want to look at this. This gives a very good overview of what's going on at this particular battle, and it just gives you kind of what's happening over the next few weeks here. He lands, captures Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, in February 6th, and then he proceeds that he's going to advance his troop from here over to Fort Donelson. Now, Fort Donelson is 12 miles away. And just again, I thought I'd give you a nice map here to kind of show this to you, where the location is and why this is so crucial for Kentucky. Like I said, Forts Henry, Fort Donelson are right there. The other thing that I'll be mentioning here is in Fort Donelson, there's a little bitty town just right next to it called Dover, Tennessee. Now, at this point, the Confederates know Grant has captured Fort Henry. And so they decide to meet at this little hotel that's in Dover. They know this, and they know it leaves middle and western Tennessee very vulnerable to Union attack at this point. And one of their major questions, and when they meet here at this hotel, is, well, what's Grant going to do? What's he planning to do? How far is this man going to advance? And when is he going to do this? And keep in mind, when you're talking about Fort Donelson, I think I'll mention it now, Like I said, Fort Henry was not a difficult battle. It was not a very well-manned garrison. It didn't have a lot of guns and a lot of batteries. As I'll show to you in later maps, Fort Donelson is the complete opposite, and so is the little town around it, Dover. Dover is they know it's going to be a last stronghold for them, and keep in mind, and I will mention, the Confederates know at some point Union reinforcements will arrive and they will get overwhelmed. They know this. They just know it's a time frame, and they're going to try to keep Fort Donelson as long as they can. But Fort Donelson is a very well-garrisoned fort. Around the town of Dover, it has a number of rifle pits in it. There is an upper and lower water battery. These water batteries are actually built about 100 feet above water level, so the trajectory for the cannons is extremely good. And they have also built trenches around Fort Donelson that are about, if you add them up, about 3 miles. So I said, this is a very well entrenched, very well fortified fort. The other thing that they're concerned about that I showed you on that earlier map is that Nashville is, I said, a major center for them. It's a major city in Tennessee. It has a number of railroads going through it. It's a major arsenal and a manufacturing center for them. So they want to make sure that they can hold on to Fort Donelson just so they have enough time to actually send more reinforcements to Nashville. So here's the map here to kind of show you this. The rifle batteries are mostly in around Dover. They put 3 miles of trenches around Fort Donelson, and look at they have a lower water battery and an upper water battery with cannonades in there. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I thought I'm going to be mentioning some of these commanders on both sides here, so I thought I'd give you just a little bit of background here. Well, obviously the overall commander for the Union forces is going to be, at this time, Brigadier General Ulysses Simpson Grant. The person who will be in charge of what will be the First Nebraska forces is going to be Brigadier General Lew Wallace. If you're not familiar with Lew Wallace, he's the individual who later on wrote Ben-Hur, wrote the very famous novel Ben-Hur. He is in command of what's known as the 3rd Division, and that consisted of 8 regiments, including the 1st Nebraska. Now, this is a little confusing when you look at this battle, because I think what happened, on paper, they have 3 divisions, but it never really formed. So really, they only have 2 divisions, but he still got being put in command of what's known as the 3rd Division, even though there's really only 2 divisions for the Union in this battle. The other famous individual, you'll see this person doing a lot of, in conjunction with Grant in a lot of his even future battles, and this is Navy Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote, who's in charge of the gunboat fleet here. The other Union commander I'll briefly mention is Brigadier General John McClelland. Confederates, only three major ones here: Brigadier General John B. Floyd, Brigadier General Gideon Pillow, and Brigadier General Simon Buckner. This I thought would be a good time to kind of bring in what's going on here and how does the 1st Nebraska get involved at the Battle of Fort Donelson. This actually occurred the summer before, in June and July 1861. Governor Alvin Saunders, who was the Nebraska Territorial Governor at the time, got a request from the Lincoln administration to form one volunteer infantry regiment. Now, the way this was kind of sold to Saunders was, well, we'd like you to form this regiment because you do have a number of forts and garrisons, particularly in the Platte River Valley, and they were really concerned about Indian attacks at the time. So they agreed to do this. They start organizing it in Omaha in June and July of 1861. The interesting part is that really kind of that whole first plan got reneged very early. I think once the war starts to heat up, all of a sudden the 1st Nebraska is no longer just staying in kind of their home territory and protecting home ground. They're soon sent eastward, and it's in case sent to Fort Donelson in Tennessee. Another big individual I want to mention here is a person who's appointed as their first colonel, and this is John Milton Thayer. Notice from his birth and death dates, he lived to the ripe old age of 86. Thayer comes to Nebraska as an Easterner. He was born and educated in Massachusetts. He actually studied law at Brown University and then practiced law in the Worcester, Massachusetts area. But at some point, he decides to uproot his family, move west. He arrives with his family in Nebraska in 1854. They sort of settle around the Lincoln, Omaha area, and he also owns quite a large amount of farmland around the Omaha area. He becomes very active in politics early on. He's active in the Republican Party, and just prior to the Civil War in 1860-61, he becomes a member of the territorial legislature. Now, it's a good point to start going into the phases of this war, of this particular battle, and what really Grant's whole idea was. Grant, in kind of this phase one here, he has sort of a tactical plan. And you'll notice with Grant here, this is not a complicated plan at all. He simply decides that he's going to surround the fort, surround the town of Dover with his forces. The Navy gunboat fleet is going to come in along the Cumberland River, and basically they're going to batter it into submission. They're going to pummel the fort into submission. It's kind of almost like siege warfare. And Grant thought he's going to do this. He's going to get reinforcements, move these troops into position quickly, and just start this. And particularly what he's trying to do, and he knows this is going to occur, the Confederate Brigadier General John Floyd is pretty much been told that he's going to come in with about 12,000 reinforcements from Bowling Green, Kentucky. So he wants to try to move his forces into those lines as soon as he can, before Floyd's Confederate troops arrive. Confederates said pretty simple what they're going to do. They're just going to be more of a defensive line because, as I said, I've told you about their fortifications, and they just need to entrench themselves, and they're going to go outward from the fort, and the two major generals that they have in command of their regiments and their brigades and their divisions are Generals Pillow and Buckner. Well, the best laid plans can go awry, and this started to happen for the Union very quickly. And there's about a series of 4 factors here. The first thing, keep in mind, this battle is taking place along a week-long period in early February. Living in Nebraska, we know that the weather does not always cooperate. And that's precisely what happened to the Union forces. Even at Fort Donelson, at Fort Henry, it had already started to rain, and flooding had already occurred. So here's Grant trying to move his men, even though it's 12 miles. It's wet, it's flooding. The other thing that happened is then it started to turn cold. And in fact, most of the battle at Fort Donelson was fought in 10 degree above zero weather. And unfortunately, the Union's troops were not supplied very well. A lot of them did not have tents. A lot of them, keep in mind the uniforms they're wearing, most of them are wool, they get wet, they get very heavy, and they got to the point where they didn't even want to mess with them anymore, so they just discarded them. So when I give you battlefield casualties for the Union, keep in mind some of those are probably dying from exposure because they probably froze to death. Keep that in mind. The other thing that happens is Grant's reinforcements don't get there quite in time. The Union lines become overextended, and so because the Confederates have, very well entrenched in these 3 miles of trenches, they really don't go anywhere. This is where Brigadier General McClellan tries to charge some of these Confederate defenses, I'd say 2 or even 3 times, and they're just too strong and they're too well manned, and pretty much McClellan's forces suffered some extremely heavy casualties in this. The other thing that I think Grant really relied on, because it worked so effectively for him at Fort Henry, he thought, well, we'll send in Andrew Foote's Union gunboat fleet. That'll help us. And this consists of 2 types of gunboats here. Ironclads, which consisted of the St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Louisville, and Condolet, and timberclads, which are the Conestoga, Tyler, and Lexington. And I thought I'd show you what these kind of look like here. Here's a reconstruction of computer animation of what a timberclad would look like. Most of these were usually converted commercial steamships, and as the name implies, they're made of wood, but you can see where the cannons are coming out here. Ironclads look a little more menacing, but they don't, to be honest with you, they're not very effective in this battle. what ends up happening, because these water batteries for Fort Henry are built up so high, the cannons have a much better trajectory. So instead of the Union gunboat fleet pummeling their batteries, it's the other way around. The Confederates just literally have a field day and just keep pounding away at the ironclads and the timberclads. What ends up happening, there's at least 2 or 3 ironclads where their iron sheathing just gets blown away. The timberclads, 2 of them, their steerage went out. And then on top of it, Andrew Foote gets pretty mortally wounded in this. So they basically have to retreat. So unfortunately, the Union gunboat fleet at the Battle of Fort Donelson is not very effective. Well, at this point, we go into pretty much the phase 3 of what's going on in this battle. The Confederates have already massed their troops up against the Union right. They're breaking the Union line. And I'll show you this a little bit later on a map. They actually do clear an escape route, like I said. They know at some point, they're going to have to give it up because the Union is going to arrive with more and more reinforcements and they're not going to be able to hold out. Now, they are glad that the Union gunboat fleet retreated because now they can at least even get more supplies along the Cumberland River coming up from Nashville. But hopefully they want to clear the escape route and escape via what's known as Charlotte Road, which I'll show you on a map. And at this stage, like early part of phase 3, the Confederates are doing extremely well against Union forces. The Union troops are retreating from their lines. Now, this leads us into one of those ironies when you talk about military history. And I read a number of accounts of this, and a lot of historians aren't really sure what happened here. Some of it blame it on miscommunication or just misunderstandings, but it is a huge Confederate blunder. Brigadier General Confederate Floyd orders his troops back into their entrenchments, even though they had just, had opened all this space out to actually escape fairly quickly. And one of the historians that I was reading said they think what he was, pretty much thinking, what he was planning on doing was, well, I'll resupply them first and regroup them, then we'll make our escape. Because look, when the Union forces are in retreat, we won't have to worry about it. That was an absolutely huge mistake when you're dealing with a Union commander like Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is an aggressive general. He sees the opening and immediately takes advantage of it and launches just a huge counterattack against the Confederate lines. And at this point, he had gotten his Union reinforcements, so he's set to go. He starts to rally his men right, and he starts to reoccupy ground, and he starts to extend his right flank, and I'll show this where this at, flank to Lick Creek, and I'll show you this out on a map so you have an idea. But what is the role of the First Nebraska in this? And this is crucial here. This comes under Lew Wallace, and what he decides to do is that he notices there's a road there. It's called Wynn's Ferry Road. And he sits there and looks at this and goes, wait a minute, there's a dip in this road. It would be fantastic if we could get that set up as a defensive line with supporting attack columns behind it. And that's exactly what he does with the First Nebraska. The First Nebraska becomes the first line of defense here with supporting columns and basically reinforcement troops behind it. And then there's also some flanking troops there. It almost looks like almost an arrow coming in with troops coming in. And let me show this to you here. In the First Nebraska's case, hate to tell you this, but John Milton Thayer is really not with them. Lew Wallace puts him in charge of the 3rd Brigade in this battle. The person who really commands the Nebraska troops in this battle, as kind of the second in command, is Lieutenant Colonel William McCord. And eventually, at one point, what Wallace shouts to Thayer is the following: file the 1st Nebraska to the right, the next regiments to the left. The 2 will support the battery between them here. Make a second line of your 4 regiments and hold it in reserve behind the 1st Nebraska. And what Wallace is simply thinking is, well, if the 1st Nebraska falters, there's these support columns in back of them to take the load. And keep in mind when you're talking about the 1st Nebraska troops here, folks, they're inexperienced. They're not battle-hardened veteran. This is really the first time they've seen hard battle here. And this is where I wanted to show you this map. Okay, what the Confederates were thinking here is they had opened this up in Charlotte Road so they can escape into Nashville, which leads right to Nashville. And where the First Nebraska's line at is about right here. This is Winds Ferry Road. So he has them up along here in a dip area with supporting columns behind them. And what ends up happening here is that the First Nebraska, they have this wave of Confederates coming in to attack them, and the First Nebraska, ladies and gentlemen, holds their own. They hold their own, they hold the line. They didn't even really need the attack columns or the defensive columns behind them at all. And Lew Wallace was so pleased with the First Nebraska's performance after he writes the official report of the battle. He wrote this in the official records. They, the First Nebraska, met the storm, no man flinching, and their fire was terrible. To say they did well is not enough. Their conduct was splendid. They alone repelled the charge. So does that tell you something? And at this point, as we go further into phase 3, the Confederates begin to lose ground. They begin to lose men. And they know, Generals Floyd and Pillow, there's just enough of the opening where Charlotte Road that I was showing you there that they know they're in trouble. They managed to slip away to Nashville with about 2,000 men. And eventually, I feel kind of sorry for someone like Buckner here. They just turn over the command to Buckner and just basically say, you're going to have to deal with it and hold out as long as you can. And at this point, it can't be much longer because the Union is gaining a tremendous amount of ground now. So the morning of February 16th, Buckner asks Grant for terms of surrender. That's as long as Buckner could hold out with the men that he had. And what I love here is the exchange between Grant and Buckner in regards to this. And I'm going to read it to you. This is from Grant to Buckner. Sir, yours of this date, proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation, is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Buckner to Grant. This is his response. The distribution of your forces under my command incident to an unexpected change of commanders and the overwhelming force your command compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept, and I love this, the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which you propose. And I said, I think Buckner, this is the first time you see Buckner kind of dealing with this. He said, Grant's an extremely aggressive general, and I think what you find here when you even read his orders, this is the tone Grant sets for his command throughout his entire career during the Civil War. I thought I would just point these out because I didn't mention them earlier, and I'm giving you very approximate stats. Sometimes when you read some of these things, it gets really hard to know, how many forces there actually were. The Union has in total, that includes with the Union gunboat fleet, about 27,000 troops, about a little over 2,200 of them are wounded, and 1,000 of them are killed. And I said it's really hard to say because I think a lot of these men probably did die of exposure, and it wasn't really battlefield injury. The Confederates have about 15,000 troops. 12,000 of them surrender. Like I said, a couple of thousand escape with 2 of the Confederate commanders, and approximately a little over 1,000 are killed. Now, the outcomes of this battle. Why is it so incredibly significant? Geographically, Kentucky's definitely going to remain in the Union now, because it's still a precarious little state yet, and then also they've taken out Forts Henry and Donelson, which then proposed them into getting, Confederate attacks right there along the border. Certainly opens up the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers. These are vital supply lines, and they're going to aid northern advances even further into the territory, certainly by the waterways, the railroads, and eventually will be Nashville as a major supply depot for them. And the one thing I will note to you, and if you ever get a chance to read it, I would highly recommend it to you. It's a very thick book, but it was published in the early 1990s, and it's called Why the North Won the Civil War. And one of the arguments the scholars make in this particular work, which I completely agree with, is that they always would make the case that, and there was a lot of scholarship being done on the war in the Eastern Theater. Well, these authors claim, and I think with conviction, is really the war for the Union is really won in the Western Theater. because the Confederates were pretty well, no, they don't have the population that the Union does, so their manning of these areas are pretty thin. And what you find within about the first, I'd say, 2 years of this war is that the Union is gaining a tremendous amount of territory in the Western theater. And they're not only gaining Southern Tennessee and Middle Tennessee, but look what happens about a year later in July of 1863. Grant goes ahead and siege and then captures Vicksburg. And he's now got the Mississippi River.